All right, let's dive in. We're taking a look today at excerpts from Havelock Ellis's Psychology of Sex.
Oh, a classic.
It is, published in 1898. So, yeah, kind of a groundbreaking text for its time, gives us a glimpse into how people were thinking about sex and the human psyche over a century ago. We're going for like a tasting menu approach here.
Okay, I like that. A tasting menu.
Yeah, just picking out some of the most fascinating insights, the ones that really make you go, huh, interesting, you know?
Definitely. I think that's the best way to approach a work like this.
Yeah.
Gets you thinking.
Exactly. So, one of the first things that struck me was Ellis arguing that even back then, just knowing the basic medical stuff about sex wasn't enough.
Yeah, he was really ahead of his time in that sense, seeing the huge role psychology plays.
Right. And of course, now we know even more. Think about hormones, brain chemistry, all the social influences.
It's a whole intricate web, isn't it?
Totally. And Ellis seemed to get that, even back then, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. It's like he had this intuition about the mind-body connection when it came to sexuality, long before we had the neuroscience to back it up.
Right. And that's what makes looking back at these older texts so fascinating. It's like tracing the roots of our current understanding.
Totally. And speaking of tracing roots, Ellis was actually quite interested in Freud's psychoanalysis.
Oh, of course. Big influence on the field back then.
Huge. Although Ellis was, how did he put it? Always friendly, but often critical? Something like that.
Shows you he wasn't just blindly following anyone. Had his own independent thinking going on.
Yeah.
Which is what we like to see.
Absolutely. So let's jump into some of the specifics. One thing that really jumped out at me was how Ellis described the sexual climax.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, he uses this word convulsion, like a sudden involuntary release of energy. Sounds kind of intense, right?
Well, you got to remember, he was writing before we understood things like neurotransmitters and all that.
Right, right.
But his core idea that there's a big physiological process happening that totally holds up.
Yeah, it's not just in your head, that's for sure. Speaking of nature, Ellis didn't just focus on humans, did he?
Nope. He saw these courtship rituals, this kind of biological dance happening all over the animal kingdom.
It's funny you should say dance, because I was going to bring up his description of slug courtship. Did you read that?
Oh, yeah, with their twisting genitals and those iridescent colors.
I know. It's wild, right? Makes you realize that even though our human rituals are different, we're all driven by that same basic urge to connect. Find a mate.
That's it. That deep biological imperative playing out in all sorts of fascinating ways makes you appreciate the diversity of nature.
It does. Now, on to something maybe a little quirkier. Ticklishness. Ellis had this fascinating take on it. He called it modesty of the skin.
Modesty of the skin. Okay, now you've got to elaborate on that one. I'm intrigued.
Me too at first. Basically, he's talking about how certain areas of the skin become more sensitive in, a sexual context.
Okay, makes sense.
And he's saying that ticklishness might be a kind of response to that heightened sensitivity, like a protective mechanism maybe.
Yeah.
He even connects it to the sensitivity of breasts during breastfeeding, suggesting like an evolutionary link.
Wow, so he's weaving together biology, psychology, even a bit of evolutionary theory.
He is. It's fascinating stuff. It's like our skin becomes this canvas for expressing all these complex emotions, and ticklishness is just one way that manifests as you think, huh.
It does. It really does.
All right, moving on to beauty and attraction. Ellis had some interesting things to say about that, too. He believed that beauty has both objective and subjective aspects, which I think most people would agree with. But here's the twist. He proposed that men are primarily drawn to visual beauty, while women are more attuned to strength, a tactile quality translated visually.
That's an interesting distinction.
Right, so it's not just about looks. It's about what those looks convey, maybe subconsciously, about a potential mate. Like, men are looking for signs of fertility. Women are looking for signs of, protection, resources.
Exactly. It aligns with some ideas in evolutionary psychology. Not a hard and fast rule, of course, but a fascinating thought nonetheless.
Totally. And, we're going to get into some potentially more controversial topics as we go. But I have to say, I was impressed by Ellis's views on childhood sexuality. He was really balanced, didn't see kids as inherently perverse or anything like that.
That's good to hear. So what was his take?
Basically, he argued that kids just don't have the same inhibitions as adults. Their sexual development unfolds gradually, and he was really emphasizing the importance of early sex education done in a healthy, age-appropriate way.
Makes sense. Knowledge is power, right?
Yeah.
Help kids understand their bodies and feelings.
Exactly. And speaking of complex feelings, I think we have to address the elephant in the room, or maybe the Oedipal complex in the room.
Ah, yes. The Oedipus complex. Freud thought it was everything.
Right. But is it really that universal?
Well, Ellis had a slightly more grounded take on it.
So just to be clear, we're talking about Freud's idea that little boys develop these unconscious sexual desires for their mothers, see their dads as rivals and all that. Intense stuff.
Very. But Ellis argued that, sure, it's natural for kids to feel close to their opposite-sex parent and maybe a little jealous of the same-sex parent, but it usually fades as they grow up. It's more about those basic family dynamics, not some deep-seated psychosexual drama, necessarily.
Right. And of course, how parents handle those dynamics can have an impact on the kid's development, but it's not a simple cause and effect thing.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important point to remember.
Absolutely. Now, this next topic was pretty taboo back in Ellis's day. Masturbation.
Ah, yes. Still a bit of a hush-hush subject, even today in some circles.
It is. But Ellis was ahead of the curve on this one. He recognized that it's prevalent across cultures. It's not just some civilized phenomenon. And he even pointed out some interesting differences between men and women. For example, he observed that women often discover masturbation later than men.
But? Go on, this is juicy.
But he suggested that women might actually find it more physically satisfying even within marriage.
Now that's intriguing. Any thoughts on why that might be?
Well, societal expectations definitely play a role. Women were often discouraged from exploring their bodies and pleasure in the same way as men, but it also suggests that women's sexual satisfaction can evolve and deepen over time, even within a committed relationship. It's not a static thing.
It's a journey, not a destination. I like that.
Exactly. And most importantly, I think Ellis was getting at the fact that shame is the problem, not the act itself.
Amen to that.
Okay, let's dive into something a little more, shall we say, unique. Fetishes.
Ah, yes, the world of fetishes, always fascinating.
Ellis believed that just about anything could become erotically charged.
Which, if you think about it, makes sense, right? We're complex creatures.
We are. He even created this whole classification system for fetishes. But what I found most interesting was his exploration of the symbolism behind them. For example, high heels. He saw them as a fetish object that symbolizes the female form, but also incorporates elements of discomfort and constraint. There's a lot to unpack there.
It's like he's saying, look, fetishes aren't just about the object itself. They're about the meanings and associations we attach to them. And those meanings can be incredibly personal, culturally influenced, all sorts of things.
Exactly. So for the listener out there, it's worth asking yourself, what seemingly ordinary things might hold a hidden erotic charge for you? And what might that reveal about your own unique desires and fantasies? It's all part of the journey of self-discovery.
Well said. And that's what makes studying human sexuality so captivating. There's always something new to learn and explore.
All right, let's get into a really important aspect of Ellis's work. His stance on sexual freedom and tolerance. He was incredibly progressive for his time, arguing that society shouldn't interfere with abnormal sexual acts unless they cause harm to others.
Wow, talk about ahead of his time. Consent and well-being as the guiding principles. That's a pretty radical concept for the Victorian era.
It is. He was basically challenging the very idea of what's normal and perverse. He recognized that sexual expression exists on a spectrum, not in rigid categories. And for his time, that was revolutionary. So I'm curious, what did Ellis have to say about same-sex relationships? That was a topic that was very much taboo back then.
You know, it's remarkable. He actually addressed same-sex relationships head-on and even discussed the possibility of marriage for same-sex couples. He argued that it could work if everyone was honest and open about their needs and desires. And remember, this was at a time when homosexuality was considered a mental illness.
Wow. He was truly pushing boundaries. It seems like Ellis was constantly advocating for a more humane and understanding approach to sexuality.
Absolutely. He was a true pioneer. And, speaking of pushing boundaries, he has some interesting things to say about the art of love itself. But I think that's a conversation for our next segment. So yeah, Ellis, he really believed that sex was more than just a biological act. It was an art form.
An art form, huh? Interesting.
Yeah, and one that required skill, consideration, a focus on mutual pleasure, which wasn't always the prevailing attitude back then.
Especially for women.
Exactly. So you can see how his writing was pretty groundbreaking for the Victorian era.
I can only imagine. What did he have to say about, like, the actual techniques and stuff?
Oh, he got specific. Definitely pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable conversation back then.
I bet. So what can we learn from Ellis's perspective on the art of love today, besides the need for, some good communication?
Right. Well, he emphasized that both partners should be active participants. It's not just about one person's pleasure.
Makes sense. It should be a shared experience.
Exactly. And it's a journey, not a destination. It's about exploration, discovery.
I like that. Speaking of exploration, Ellis also talked about this idea of sublimation.
Ah, yes. Sublimation. Channeling that sexual energy into something else. Creative pursuits, intellectual endeavors, that sort of thing.
Right. It makes you wonder if some of those, like, really prolific artists and writers throughout history, maybe they were sublimating all that sexual energy.
Well, it's definitely a possibility. But remember, sublimation's not about denying your sexuality. It's more about, like, finding healthy outlets, transforming that raw passion into something productive.
So, like, creative fuel.
Exactly. It can be a powerful force if you can harness it. For our listener, I'm curious, have you ever experienced this? Maybe you threw yourself into work after a breakup or found inspiration during a time of, intense romantic longing.
I think most people have probably felt something like that at some point.
It's a good reminder that the sexual impulse can be a source of inspiration, motivation, even if it's not expressed directly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Ellis's work, what are some of the key takeaways for someone who's maybe just learning about him for the first time?
I think the biggest one is that connection between mind and body when it comes to sex. He was really emphasizing that it's not just a physical act.
Right. It's about thoughts, emotions, experiences, the whole package.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's his progressive stance on sexual freedom and tolerance. He was a pioneer, advocating for individual rights, challenging those outdated norms.
His views on same-sex relationships were particularly ahead of their time.
They were. It's a reminder that we should approach sexuality with compassion, an open mind, and a willingness to learn and grow.
I love that. So before we move on to the next part, any final thoughts for our listener?
Don't be afraid to explore. Challenge yourself. Question those old assumptions. The world of human sexuality is vast and fascinating.
Beautifully said. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with Ellis. The biology, the fetishes, his views on freedom and tolerance. But there's one more piece I want to touch on before we wrap up. His thoughts on sexual education.
Oh, that's a good one. He was a huge advocate for sexual education. Big believer in knowledge and making informed choices.
Which, back then that was pretty radical. Sex was such a taboo subject.
Totally. But he saw education as a way to empower people. Bust those myths and misconceptions.
Right. It makes you wonder, like, what if his ideas had been more widely accepted back then? How different would things be?
It's a fascinating thought experiment. But even today, his message is still so relevant. We still have so much work to do when it comes to sex ed.
It's true. There's still so much stigma and misinformation out there.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to keep having these conversations.
Couldn't agree more. Now, before we sign off, there's one final point from Ellis that really stuck with me. He believed that the sexual impulse itself, it's not inherently good or bad, it's just there. A force.
Right. It's how you channel it that matters.
Exactly. So it's not about judging certain behaviors. It's about taking responsibility for your own actions, finding what works for you.
And respecting others' choices, too.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an incredible journey through Ellis's work. I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too. It's amazing how these ideas from over a century ago can still challenge us and make us think differently.
They really do. So as we wrap up this deep dive into psychology of sex, any parting words for our listeners?
Keep learning, keep exploring, and never be afraid to question the status quo. The world of human sexuality is full of wonder and complexity.
Beautifully said. Well, that's it for our deep dive into Havelock Ellis. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll be back soon with another exploration of knowledge. Until then, stay curious,